good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Just as I begin, I'd like to welcome Ron Bedard, the President and CEO of Dofasco. Thank you, Ron, for coming here today. More substantively, thank you for leading one of Canada's great steel companies, but also for helping us in designing some of these support measures that I'm going to talk about today, and some of that we put in place. This is an important day for Canada's workers. Look, we know the world's changing. We know that this decades-long process of our ever closer economic relationship between Canada and the United States has ended, and as a consequence of that, many of our strengths have become our vulnerabilities, particularly in those industries that are most tightly integrated with the United States. Headline, last year, 75% of our exports went to the U.S. 90%, 90% of our lumber exports went to the U.S. 90% of our aluminum exports went to the United States. 90% of our steel exports went there, all bound for a single market that has changed. Overall, for the Canadian economy, we estimate that U.S. tariffs and the uncertainty that they're creating will cost Canadians around 1.8% of GDP. That's about $50 billion lost from our economy, or the equivalent of $1,300 for every Canadian. And this is happening fast. It's a rupture, which means that our economic strategy needs to change dramatically and rapidly. And that change is in Budget 2025, our plan to confront these challenges and emerge even stronger, to move our economy from reliance to resilience, and to give ourselves far more than any foreign nation can ever take away. Le budget vise à bâtir un Canada fort en mettant l'accent sur ce que nous pouvons contrôler, c'est-à-dire bâtir ici, chez nous, afin de protéger les Canadiens et Canadiennes et de leur donner les moyens de réussir. Stimuler notre productivité pour assurer une prospérité durable. Transformer la façon dont le gouvernement travaille pour vous. Diversifier nos partenariats commerciaux à l'étranger afin de créer plus de possibilités et d'accroître notre indépendance. The core of the strategy in Budget 2025 is to unleash $1 trillion in total investments in Canada over the course of the next 5 years. That alone will increase our GDP by over 3.5%, or $3,500 for every Canadian worker, more than twice what's being taken from us. Now, to help get there, we must protect our workers and our industries who are most exposed to U.S. tariffs. That means in steel, aluminum, auto, and lumber sectors. Help them bridge to the future. Nous avons déjà pris des mesures décisives pour limiter les exportations d'acier étranger, devenir notre meilleur client en achetant canadien, permettre à nos industries stratégiques de se diversifier et de conquérir de nouveaux marchés, protéger nos travailleurs et nos industries qui sont touchés par les droits de douane américaines. Back in July, we restricted foreign steel imports entering Canada's market, expanded training and income support for steel workers, and provided liquidity relief for businesses. The government, for example, provided a $400 million loan to help Algoma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie to transition to a business model that's less reliant on the United States. In August, we introduced new measures to help the softwood lumber industry stay competitive, including financing for company restructuring, investments to diversify products, income and training supports for affected workers, and prioritizing Canadian lumber in home building. In September, we launched a comprehensive industrial strategy with new reskilling programs, a new $5 billion strategic response fund to help businesses pivot to new markets, and we announced that we would create a new Buy Canadian policy across federal agencies. We also reduced red tape and increased loan limits to help large firms access the liquidity that they need. these measures are working. We've received close to 1,500 applications from companies across the steel, aluminum, lumber, manufacturing, automotive, and seafood sectors through our Regional Tariff Response Initiative. In the steel sector alone, more than 230 firms have applied and support's already being delivered. So some examples. Because of these initiatives, Cherubini Metal Works in Nova Scotia is modernizing its metal and fabrication lines to export more products overseas. And Hooper Welding in Hamilton will grow its capacity to produce fabrication equipment required for Canadian and international energy projects. Grâce à ce financement ciblé, les entreprises canadiennes intègrent de nouvelles technologies, lancent de nouveaux produits pour diversifier leur marché, s'assurent de jouer un rôle dans les chaînes d'approvisionnement nationales et, par ces améliorations, participent à des missions commerciales partout dans le monde. Our investments are also protecting workers, providing relief to nearly 37,000 Canadians during this period of uncertainty. So far, they've prevented more than 14,000 Canadians from losing their jobs. More broadly, across our economy, employment is rebounding after the early impacts of the trade war. More than 120,000 total jobs have been created since March. What we're doing today is to reinforce that momentum with new strengthened measures to accelerate the transformation of the Canadian steel and lumber industries, to build strong domestic demand for their products, and to empower their workers and businesses to seize new markets at home and abroad. So these new measures focus on three core objectives. First, to further limit foreign steel imports so as to increase domestic demand for Canadian steel producers. Second, to make it easier to buy and build with Canadian steel and lumber. And third, to invest in workers and businesses so they have the tools and the resources that they need to drive this industrial transformation. So let me start with limiting foreign steel imports to ensure that our steel producers have a bigger share of our market. Doing so will unlock hundreds of millions of dollars in domestic demand for those producers. We will reduce tariff-free steel imports from non-free trade area partners from 50% of 2024 levels, as it is today, to 20% of those levels. This will open up more than $850 million in new domestic demand for Canadian steel. Second, we will reduce tariff-free steel imports from non-CUSMA free trade area partners from 100% of 2024 levels to 75% of those levels, unlocking more than $540 million in additional market access for our producers. We'll impose a global 25% tariff on targeted imported steel derivative products, such as wind towers, prefabricated buildings, fasteners, and wires, to grow demand for Canadian-made steel. Those products as a whole represent about a $10 billion market. And we will toughen our broader compliance measures to prevent foreign steel dumping. To do so, the Canadian Border Service Agency will be equipped with a dedicated steel compliance team, enhanced detection of false declarations, and expanded online reporting tools. Our temporary horizontal remission of Canadian tariffs on imports has helped Canadian businesses deal with the early impacts of those tariffs. However, over the longer term, such broad remissions would only hurt Canada's steel sector. So to move away from relying on imported steel and to give Canadian companies time to adjust their supply chains to use Canadian steel, those temporary remission measures will end on January 31st, 2026, for steel used in Canada for manufacturing, food and beverage packaging, and agricultural production. Now, the second broad way to drive transformation of our strategic industries is by becoming our own best customer. So we'll build big with Canadian suppliers, investing in roads, bridges, homes, and community centers. A bit later this year, we'll implement that Buy Canadian policy, which will ensure that Canadian materials, including steel and lumber, are prioritized in all contracts over $25 million, and that this applies across federal grants and contribution programs, especially those in infrastructure. To maximize the use of Canadian softwood lumber in housing and infrastructure, we will prioritize shovel-ready multi-year projects that can begin in the next 12 months using, of course, Canadian wood. With a funding allocation of roughly $700 million next year, Build Canada Homes, our new federal home building agency, this alone will create $70 to $140 million of new demand for Canadian wood products and attract private and provincial capital to multiply that impact. In order to build on that, I'm announcing today that we will make it more affordable to transport Canadian steel and lumber across this country by cutting freight rates for transporting steel and lumber interprovincially by 50%. We'll do that through funding directly Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railways. And finally, we will increase protections for Canadian steel and lumber workers and those businesses so they can adapt and seize new opportunities. We'll help employers retain workers by expanding our earlier supports and enhancing our work-sharing programs, increasing income replacement ratios, income replacement benefits from 55% to 70%. We will also provide an additional $500 million to the Business Development Bank of Canada's Softwood Lumber Guarantee Program to ensure that companies have the financing and the credit support that they need to maintain and restructure their operations during this period of transformation. And similarly, we will deploy $500 million in funding under the Large Enterprise Tariff Loan Facility, specifically for softwood lumber firms, the larger ones facing liquidity pressures. We'll make it easier for the forestry sector to access federal support by establishing a single window for applications, a one-stop shop to help companies navigate our broad suite of support programs. And lastly, we will launch a Canadian Forest Sector Transformation Task Force that seeks input and recommendations from provinces, territories, and industry on how to seize new opportunities in softwood lumber and create new growth in the sector. Ces mesures de soutien, jumelées à celles mises en place plus tôt cette année, permettront aux producteurs d'acier canadiens et de bois d'œuvre canadiens de bénéficier d'un accès au marché intérieur représentant des centaines de millions de dollars. En effet, c'est plus de milliards de dollars. Elles créeront de nouvelles possibilités pour les travailleurs à mesure que la demande intérieure augmentera et offriront aux entreprises le soutien dont elles ont besoin pour s'adapter au contexte mondial en pleine évolution. Nous veillons à ce que les entreprises canadiennes du secteur de l'acier et de bois d'œuvre disposent des capitaux, des talents et du temps nécessaires pour acquérir les compétences, les outils et les installations qui leur permettront de contribuer à bâtir une économie canadienne forte. The hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure and housing investments that Budget 2025 will unleash will create significant demand for Canadian steel and lumber, as will our new trade and investment partnerships around the world. Last week, I was in Abu Dhabi, where the UAE announced their decision to invest $70 billion in Canada. In Johannesburg, for the G20, we launched discussions towards a Canada-South Africa Foreign Investment Promotion and Partnership Agreement that will deepen investment between our two nations. And we agreed to launch comprehensive free trade talks with India, the world's fifth largest economy. Nous avons entamé des négociations commerciales avec EAU et les Philippines et la Thaïlande, et nous travaillons à la finalisation de notre accord avec l'ANAS. Cela s'ajoute aux accords que notre gouvernement a déjà conclus avec l'Indonésie, l'Équateur, l'Union européenne et l'Allemagne. Les pays du monde entier souhaitent investir au Canada et bâtir avec nous. Nous réalisons les investissements stratégiques nécessaires pour que nous puissions produire et exporter plus de ce dont le monde a besoin, notamment de l'acier canadien et de bois d'œuvre canadien. The Canadian steel and lumber industries will always be at the heart of Canada's competitiveness, our security, and our strength. These are sectors that reflect our country's character, resilient and forward-looking, with a history of reinventing themselves at pivotal moments. Et à ce moment charnière de notre histoire, le Canada passe de la dépendance à la résilience. Nous pouvons nous donner bien plus que ce que n'importe quel gouvernement étranger ne pourra jamais nous enlever. Nous bâtissons une seule économie canadienne au lieu de 13. Nous bâtissons ensemble de projets d'intérêt national. Nous réalisons des investissements sans précédent dans notre défense et notre sécurité et nous diversifions nos relations commerciales. We'll build Canada strong with the workers and the resources that build our community strong. Canadian workers, Canadian steel and lumber. With them, we'll build Hamilton strong, Sault Ste. Marie strong, Saguenay fort, Miramichi fort, for Canada strong. Thank you. Merci. I look forward to your questions.